Well, welcome to everyone. I can see from my view that there's still people coming into the waiting room, and that's great. Richard will be admitting people as we get going. I am very excited today to have with me one of my closest friends. And Julie Ingersoll and I met in 1991. I had just gotten my doctorate from Duke University and was teaching at a small liberal arts college in California. And Julie was a graduate student at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Almost as soon as I arrived in Santa Barbara, I met a professor who worked at UCSB, Wade Clark Roof, a noted sociologist of religion. And in our very first conversation, he said to me, I have a graduate student you have to meet. I just have a feeling you two would be friends. And he told me a little bit about Julie. I think he introduced us within a week, maybe 10 days of that conversation. And we have been friends ever since, including the fact that she was the best woman in my wedding. She will never let me call her the maid of honor because there's no maid about it. She's the best woman in my wedding to my wonderful husband, Richard, and was instrumental in convincing me that Richard was the man for me. So we have many ties, intellectual and personal and friend ties that are the kinds of bonds you just, you'd love to share with someone. And so it is a pleasure to have her here. She is professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida. We taught on the same faculty together for a year at Rhodes College in Memphis. She also taught at Millsaps College for, was it 2 years, Julie?
Just one.
Just
and then
one.
at Southwest Missouri State for 2.
Okay. So a couple places in Mississippi, Memphis, and Missouri. There you go. A lot of M's going up the Mississippi River there. And then landed at Florida, where she has been for most of her career. The interesting thing about Julie, well, there are many interesting things about Julie. She is a world-class fly fisher who wrote for several years a fly fishing column for one of the best fishing magazines in the United States. And she has been interested in what we now call Christian nationalism for the entire 30 years that we have been friends. And so it is great to have her here to talk about this really significant and important subject that she has spent a lifetime working on and writing about, and that now has come to the fore of the political consciousness of many, 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 many more Americans. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here.
Yeah.
Kind words from you. That's so sweet, Diana. Yeah.
Oh, well, I know that's always the way it goes. That people always say that I'm the sweet one.
Yeah. I'm not the wordsmith. You are, but back at you both.
Well, I mentioned to people in my Substack that you and I, talk several times a year, and we just sort of pick up the phone and say, oh my gosh, what's going on? So that's really
see what just happened.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know what to make of this. So I wanted to start a little bit maybe before our telephone call type conversation, because one of the things that I think is happening is people really don't know how to define Christian nationalism. And I had just gotten, right before we got on this Zoom, an email from Vote Common Good, which is an organization that's run by Doug Pagitt, minister out of Minnesota. And he's doing a thing where he's following sort of election events and has developed a program called Confronting Christian Nationalism. Yeah. And so he just sent out an email about it. And he said that the first point is most people don't know what Christian nationalism is. So I'm really interested is how do you define this when someone asks you what Christian nationalism is?
Well, I'm really glad you started there. And I struggle with this quite a bit because it seems to me that most people, like, the term is taken off. Okay. And it does refer to the thing that we've always just kind of called evangelicalism. And when you read the efforts to differentiate it from evangelicalism, to me, they kind of fall short, either they're based in, evangelicalism is this Bevington quadrilateral belief-based kind of description, or it's not really the gospel, or it's not true Christianity, or whatever that is. But there's never, I find it hard to define that language. Although, I mean, on the one hand, it's easy to talk about a religious political movement that embraces the idea that this is a Christian nation, that wants to Christianize all of public space, that wants to work toward a theocracy, and the various strategies that they have to do that. And of course, that's what I have been writing about for most of my career. On the other hand, there's this effort to differentiate Christian nationalism from these other older terms that we've used, like evangelicalism. I'm really happy about the first part, and happy that it has taken off and that people are starting to pay attention to it. I struggle a little bit with the second part. And one reason is because I think that the reason these folks that we're now calling Christian nationalists have been so successful is that they have always had a super long-term plan. Like their time horizon is not the next election cycle. It's 200 years. And they started in the 50s, so they're well into it, and they're starting to bear fruit. And I think if we just kind of cut off all that we've done to try to explain who these people are and what they're about, to adopt a brand new term, I think we lose that continuity and the context that's really important. And I don't think that we can deal with what's coming at us if we don't understand it and where it came from and what their goals really are. And I think we lose all of that if we just sort of come up with a whole brand new term. So I'm less excited about that term than some people, although it's taken off. So I guess that's the term we use now. I just call them evangelicals. And the difference is, even in the polling data of the sociologists who are the biggest promoters of this language of Christian nationalism, you look at what they write and they say it's a political movement and not a religious movement. I don't know what that means. They don't tell you what they mean by those two terms that allow you to pull them apart and think about them as separate from each other.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark comment from you, since you are a sociologist of religion. I mean, you're basically saying that the sociologists of religion who invented this term have a bit of an ideological kind of agenda going on there.
Well, I think there is an agenda behind it. And I think that it's because they're Christian and they're building a protected strategy to try to insulate their version of Christianity from the critique. And I kind of get that. But I also, in one sense, I'm a sociologist of religion, but I'm a sociologist of religion trained in religious studies. And that's a really big difference. So sociologists of religion often ask uninterrogated questions. Religious studies is always, what is the classification system that's helping us to think about this thing in this way and not that way, right? So that's a religious studies 101 kind of question. Why are we defining this term this way, right? And it's not a sociology term. So in a sense, my critique comes out of religious studies side rather than the sociology side, I think.
Oh, well, I've really struggled with this too, because I don't think everybody who is a white Christian nationalist, to use the term that we're now using, basically invented by Samuel Perry, as far as I can figure out.
Well, and Whitehead and Gorski, and there's a cadre of them.
Yeah, Philip Gorski and Andrew Whitehead, is that the three? That's where the name seems to have come from. And those three are evangelicals, correct?
I don't think so. I think Whitehead is a kind of like I embrace the term kind of atheist, right?
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's lots of people who aren't theist, and then there are people who identify as atheist, and I think he's one of the second kind. I could be wrong, but
because I know Samuel Perry is an evangelical, and he was on Frontline the other night and talked about that himself.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, he did. And so there clearly is some desire on the part of some evangelicals who don't consider themselves part of this political effort
Mhm.
to make that distinction and put politics over here and religion over here and say, well, evangelicalism is a religious movement, and what
Mhm.
this is really a political movement.
But
But
that's not new, right? Isn't that what Marsden and Hatch and Knoll, I mean, that's kind of what they did in history, right?
yeah, it really is. It's exactly in my training in history,
Yeah,
Christianity. That's exactly what evangelical historians were doing in the 90s.
right.
But one of the things I think is really interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this, was that study that came out just a few weeks ago that looked at what evangelicals believe. And I mean, the numbers about what they believed regarding things like the Trinity and who
Oh,
Jesus was and all these different theological ideas
uh-huh.
were abysmal. As a matter of fact, you could walk into a liberal Presbyterian church and probably get better numbers on those questions theologically
Interesting.
than they did on this study. And yet, when they asked them the political questions, and these are all people who call themselves evangelicals, so that's how they were in this study.
Mhm, mhm.
90% of them agreed on things like, that abortion should be outlawed across the country in all cases. And, 95% of them thought that Trump was the best president ever. And so there was this complete sort of almost unanimity on political
Mhm.
ideas and a complete bankruptcy of any kind of theological idea. So I think that study really helped to support what you're wondering about, if there
Mhm.
is any distinction left between the word evangelical and right-wing political movement that we're now calling Christian nationalism.
Well, and Marsden, Hatch, and Knoll doing that in history isn't the only example, right? Like Don Dayton trying to do it. There's a long history in evangelicalism of sort of progressive lefty evangelicals who are always trying to preserve some sort of evangelical identity, and at the same time distance themselves from all the stuff that evangelicals are doing. Well,
Mhm.
in my mind, if 80% of evangelicals are supporting Donald Trump, then that is what evangelicalism is now. It's never been some fixed thing that is existing apart from history and culture. It's always been contextual, like everything else is. And so that's just what it is now. And I don't, other than somebody who's trying to build a protective hedge around their personal religious community, I can't see any reason to try to carve out a space where somehow that's not representative of evangelicalism. That's
Yeah.
what they've become.
Yeah. When I wrote a piece on it this summer, I was trying to make a bit of a distinction there because I was mostly worried at how much of the I love working with journalists. I spend an enormous amount of my time with journalists, but at the same time, there is this capacity in journalism. I call it kind of the herd mentality, that say a term pops up and it
Mhm.
becomes kind of a blanket that journalists just kind of throw over everything.
Mhm.
So I was very concerned that there be just a little bit more nuance with the term. And so one of the things I suggested was not necessarily, that there's this pocket of pure evangelicals that are retaining the true faith and that everybody else is this sort of corrupted political form of evangelicalism, but that within evangelicalism, there were sort of harder and softer forms of what we call Christian nationalism, a kind of a sort of a soft patriotic, America is a Christian nation, wave the flag, means I say the Pledge of Allegiance and cry when I see military parades, that kind of thing. C.S. Lewis talks about that in one of his essays from World War II. And then there's the sort of this really hardcore Christian nationalism that has become almost like a policy agenda or a political sort of necessity for people to be on board with every bit of the platform. So is that maybe a legitimate kind of separation to make, or you still don't? Do
Well,
you think the gradations aren't helpful?
I don't think that's not helpful for me, but you and I sit in such different places now. So I could see how in the work that you do that, and you're more likely to see that kind of a gradation than I am too. I mean, you go out in the world working with Christians, and I end up talking just to specifically crazy Christians. So my take on that is going to be shaped by that. So I don't, it doesn't resonate necessarily with the framing that is working for me at the moment, but I don't know that that's a claim about how it is. It's just about how it looks here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I do think that the context in which we do our teaching really makes a huge difference.
But you
in
know,
that
the
regard.
evangelical, the post-evangelicals that have just been with, that you were writing about, I'll tell you what, they're all going to agree with me that this is evangelicalism, right? So it's the
That's
people
correct.
who are trying to make this distinction between evangelicalism and Christian nationalism are people for whom that tradition still kind of fits in some way.
Mhm.
And all of the people who have been harmed by it, that showed up at that theology and beer or whatever it was, sounded like a lot of fun, but all of those people who started describing the way in which they had been beat up in this world, they see exactly how the evangelical tradition led to where we are now.
Yeah. No, that's completely fair. I think my main desire for nuance is giving some of those people a little bit of running room to be able to talk to their parents.
So I'm just going to talk to all your peeps here for a second.
Yeah, please
She's a
do.
lot nicer than I am. She really is. I'm the dark one that always sees the worst in everything. So I keep her close in part because then otherwise there's like no hope in the world. So yeah, that's good, Diana. You do that. I'm glad somebody's doing that. I really am. I don't, you know me, all that comes out is the snark. But that's why we're all different.
No, that's right. And I actually need this piece to keep me honest, as you know, through the through the years. I think that people would be really fascinated to know, can you just tell a little bit about your story about how you got interested in writing about this subject 30 years ago?
Sure. Well, so there was a period in which I became part of this world, but that's actually, it kind of starts in college, taking an introduction to the study of religion course in my freshman year because it filled a humanities requirement. And I got really interested in not religion necessarily, but the study of religion and the ways that discipline gives us these different frameworks to interrogate how things are, and whether or not they, like how they got to be the way they are, and whether or not that's in the nature of things or whether that's something that could be changed. And so I was an undergraduate major in political science with a minor in religion. And my dad was from Gloucester. So in the at holidays, when we went to see his family, I'd go down to the wharfs and hang out with the Moonies because I thought they were interesting. And in college, I ended up meeting a Christian Reconstructionist. I didn't know what that was. But we dated and married. So then I kind of got into that world, and I spent probably 15, 16 years, I guess, as part of that world. But it was always an uneasy fit. I never gave up my feminist commitments. My friends will tell you that I had those in the 6th grade. So I've always been that kind of rah feminist. And I kept my name when I got married, and that was a whole big scandal. And
you were the weirdest evangelical I ever knew weird. All those years ago.
I know. And I was an anti-abortion activist at Operation Rescue, and that fit in my mind. I understood that to mesh perfectly with feminism. I didn't see it as contradictory. I can still understand, and I think it's that the fact that the way that I see the world is always like a kaleidoscope that's just off. And so that's why I'm always so intrigued by how things that seem unfathomable to me can make sense to other people. Because I've always wanted people to try to understand me. So that's something that I find challenging and interesting and fun. And that kind of pulled me along on this journey. But because I always wanted to learn more, and I was inquisitive and asking questions, and I ended up going to the very, very liberal at the time Fuller Seminary. And then off to grad school, and it was grad school was an intellectual journey for me. I was what I got in grad school what you hope you get in grad school, instead of what so many people do get, which is this drudgery of, I don't know. It's when you listen to other people talk about their grad school experiences, it sounds like it was awful, and mine was, in Santa Barbara, and it was just idyllic. So it was just a process of unpacking. It was what now the youngs call deconstructing. um we didn't have, we kind of did a lot of that at the same time, and we didn't have a name for it at the time. And we didn't have Twitter and Facebook and all those other ways of connecting with other people doing it. But I don't know what else to say about that. If you have something particular in mind, I'm not, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted people to know that you had been inside of that world. I mean, and that was one of the things that caused us to be friends, is that I was married to this very conservative Calvinist and at the time, and that whole world was being upended theologically by the introduction of Christian Reconstruction, which is the old name for part of this big trajectory of what we now call white Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And so I was really familiar with that, even though the person I was married to rejected those ideas. Nevertheless, you had to wrestle with them within the world that he was part of. And there were a lot of people who were his friends who went over into these more fulsome corners of Christian Reconstruction, things like rejecting birth control and believing that no woman should ever, stop a pregnancy from happening, and that families needed to be really big, and that everyone should be homeschooled. So there were tons of people in my circle that were like that in the 80s and the early 90s. And that's when we met. And it was such a relief to meet you. I mean, that's why I think Clark Roof said we'd be friends, because you were in that same world, but even in almost a more rigid corner of it than I was. And you were coming out of it pretty fast. And so,
but the rigidity also was shared between those two communities, because they are both grounded in that very rigid kind of Reformed Calvinist, like we now call them Theo Bros, right? We even have a name for that now. You can find these people all over on Twitter that have no idea how to have a conversation with other people, and they don't necessarily care about anything beyond the sort of two-dimensional theological rationality that they happen to be pursuing at the moment. And there was a lot of commonality temperamentally, I think, between your ex's Reformed world and my ex's Reformed world.
Yeah, I think that we're the problem with women.
I have been told
people
that
in the Reformed world point to and say, well, if you let women start asking questions, this is Julie and Diana, or what's going to happen to you. So I'm trying to think about how in the world, I mean, we both came from this very conservative Calvinist place. We saw what was happening, how it was beginning to influence evangelicalism that was kind of a different ilk in some ways, I think, overall in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. How in the world is this sort of small Calvinist, hyper conservative idea about biblical law replacing the United States Constitution, how does that come to take over all of evangelicalism? Can you shorthand that for us? I know there's
I think I can. I mean, that's kind of the point of my book, which is that even though this is an obscure movement that most people have never heard of, the fact is they had a 200-year plan to transform all of culture and bring it under the lordship of Jesus Christ, as they would say. And at the linchpin of that plan was to undermine public education and to replace it initially with Christian schools and then secondarily with homeschools. And so now you have a whole subculture of people who are educated in a particular curriculum that comes out of this world and is still really shaped by this world. And if you participate in homeschooling conventions, like homeschooling initially was what I like to call the granola people, right? They were kind of hippies that lived off the grid. But this was completely overtaken by this far right wing form of Christianity. And if you go to homeschool conventions, you can only buy curriculum that is based in how they read the Bible. You can only buy young earth creationist kinds of science textbooks. You forget about buying actual science textbooks. You can't even buy like day age theory creationist, like the whole young earth creationist thing is completely taken over. The so-called Christian American history, every part of the curriculum that as they understood it, developed it, and advocated for has become Christian school and homeschool curriculum. And in many parts of the country, those schools are funded by taxpayer dollars. In Florida, those schools get taxpayer money to teach that stuff.
Yeah, they're effectively teaching a very particular version of conservative Christian doctrine.
They're teaching theocracy.
Yeah.
They call it theonomy, but yeah, they're teaching theonomy.
Yeah, well, since nobody knows what theonomy means and everybody
Theocracy
knows
works a little better. Yeah.
what theocracy means, to hide your intention is a good idea. And theonomy only means biblical law.
That's right.
Right.
But that's what a theocracy is a civil society that's ordered along biblical law. So that's the goal. And I used to say that because when people like Rushdoony would get any public attention, it was always Bruce's John Rushdoony, parenthetical reference, who advocated the killing of homosexuals, the death penalty for homosexuality. It was always this kind of parenthetical reference. And he did advocate that. And obviously that's horrible. But years ago, I would always say, but that's not going to happen. And we need to pay attention to the things that are going to happen, like they want to destroy public schools. And I still think we should have been paying attention to the fact that they wanted to destroy public schools, although now I'm way less sure that the other stuff isn't actually a real possible threat. They're moving pretty fast to consolidate power. When you look at you promoted this session as about the midterms, and when you look at these elections coming up and the election deniers who they've made a lot of progress at consolidating power, and the kinds of things like, who'd have ever thought that they could actually not just overturn Roe versus Wade, but get to a place where they are arresting women for seeking to have abortions.
Yeah.
Limiting access to medication for women because it may have something to do with abortion, but they need it for some other reason. Right. It's crazy.
I want you to talk about that for a moment. What do you see as the link between election denialism and Christian nationalism? Why is this particular conspiracy theory caught on with so much energy? And that's actually one of the things that Doug talked about in his newsletter today with Vote Common Good, about how incredibly far spread election denialism is within the candidate pool of the GOP. So what's the connection there with the stuff that you've been studying?
Well, I have two answers to that. The first is that this movement is about consolidating power to reestablish the kingdom of God and rebuild America along lines that they think are commanded by the Bible. And election denialism it gives them power. So there's the kind of basic answer. But at the same time, in a piece that I've recently written for the Journal of Religion and Violence, I've talked about how conspiracism and apocalypticism and paranoia about persecution have made their way into this broad public conversation. And this is one of the reasons I don't want to see the language divorced from just evangelicalism, because evangelicalism has given us people who are schooled in ways of thinking that lend themselves to those things. So for example, if you look at the transformation over creationism and the battles over creationism that have been going on for decades, the teaching of creationism, as opposed to teaching evolution, they'll have these events that are, so there was one here in Jacksonville that I went to, and it was called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So you'd go to and that's Josh.
Yeah, I was borrowing the old language from the 70s.
Yeah. And so you go to this thing and there's nothing about evidence, and there's no effort to make an argument that will lead you to a specific intellectual conclusion. Instead, I think it's more effectively understood as a practice of ritual. these people are there repeating these kind of tropes about the distinctions between evolution and godliness and godlessness, and the kind of and these ways of knowing that are based in giving up your commitment to the autonomy of reason in favor of submission to God's authority. And you're practicing all this stuff in the context of these creationist events. And they're more than conferences, right? So you can go to the Creationist Museum or the Ark Park. I went there a couple of years ago. That was really interesting. There's this replica of Noah's Ark in the middle of the country. And you go around there and you see all these little dioramas, and there's a whole bunch, there's this thing in the Bible about not adding a jot or tittle. There's a whole bunch they've added in order to make this thing that looks like an ark to be livable. Like they've added spouses for a whole bunch of people that we have no reason to think they had spouses, and they've got their little cabins and their little stoves, and it's all domestic. And
so it's like wild. The Viking cruise ship of the Bible.
But this is ritual. These people take their children there the way Americans would take their kids to Disney to inculcate them in kind of corporate capitalism. It's very much a kind of religious practice rather than an idea. And it trained people to be amenable to embracing ideas that are it's group think, and it's a benefit to the group, right? So it isn't about becoming convinced with evidence that this is true, but it's rather about it's about identity and believing the things that your group believes and rejecting the things that the out groups believe, right? So it's much more cultural than it is intellectual. And I don't think we pay enough attention to how religion works as culture. I think we pay too much attention to the beliefs and not enough to how it functions culturally.
I watched the Frontline special the other night on Mike Flynn and his rallies that he's doing around voting and election and election denialism. And that was one of the things that was really striking to me, is that there was no intellectual argument that was presented at all, but it was exactly like some of the kinds of revival meetings that I went to as a teenager. And those always are more about joining part of a group, forming an identity, participating in rituals that you hold in memory with other people.
Yeah.
And so it functions almost in effect sacramentally or Eucharistically, the way we talk about, say, a Catholic church or a liberal mainline church. These revivals are doing that same thing. And it is forming people within a story. And so there's no arguing with that. I mean, that's the thing that really is just astonishing to me.
And I think there's two directions to look at that. It's one, the ritual practices are shaping the individuals, are shaping individual identity and group connections and everything. But it's training the individuals to be a certain kind of person, to think in a certain way. It's training them in ways of knowing that are easily transferable over to conspiracy theories, because these are conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And so you could put as much factual information as you wanted to in front of these people about numbers and how election systems work. And we've seen this, all of the less, sold out kind of Republican secretaries of state who literally said, no, I'm not going along with this. And they brought out their facts and their figures and their computer statistics and their counting people and their processes and procedures. And they said, look, this is all in line. And what happens is that they get called heretics and threats of their houses being firebombed. And so to try to address this by those kinds of mechanisms, which you would think in a democracy would, work, facts, figures, etc. That doesn't work when you're talking about a ritually shaped identity.
It really doesn't.
Yeah. Okay, this is what always happens to me whenever we talk.
What's that?
Well, my smile turns into a big frown.
Yeah.
This is really hard to talk about. Um, so so
Yeah, sorry, Naomi. Naomi's right here with us.
yeah, it's okay. Naomi, Julie always does this to me, and we're
This is
still
why these
friends.
conversations usually have wine.
Yes, that is true. Okay, so the idea then perhaps of these midterms is less about, in effect, it's not even about taking over Congress, I think, at this point. It's more like proving your identity, that you're part of this particular narrative and this particular community. It's almost like a loyalty test in the sense that you're
It is.
describing.
And it's also, I think, about taking over at the state level. Because again, getting back to one of the reasons these folks have been so effective is they don't think just in terms of the near future and an election cycle. They're thinking long term. And they've made tons of progress at the state legislative, like Florida voted for Obama. And yet there's a complete lock on the legislature and the governor's office here with not just Republicans, but far right-wing Republicans. Because they've been so successful at consolidating power at the state level. And I think that these Secretary of State races across the country are just so unnerving, because those people can shut down voting.
This has been one of the interesting things about living in Virginia while you were living in Florida over these last years, because in many ways, this kind of Christian Reconstruction had its home base in one of its birthplaces in Virginia. But what's been largely successful in Virginia, or is still being contended in Virginia, is local politics. And I got really involved in local politics here. And what was the case for the last 15 years is that people have been pressing back on a local level about these kinds of things. And that was what was so shocking about the Glenn Youngkin election to us all. There was more residual power of this kind of Christian nationalism than most people thought was present in Virginia, because we have been so powerfully organized to get that out of Virginia politics, and it had worked seemingly for a decade, and then all of a sudden it didn't work. And so now we're still facing, and that's when you say it's a long-term thing. It's like you think you win, and then they come back. It's like Groundhog Day of right-wing Christian politics.
Yeah. And when people are talking about, I was on Twitter the other day about the kind of fallout from Roe versus Wade, and the people who think that they're safe because they're in a blue state, and they don't think that policies are going to change. They're going to keep the way that they hammered at Roe, and hammered year after year, decade after decade, is the way that they're going to hammer at this. They're for states' rights, but only until they get enough power to do something nationally. And that's true, that's true going all the way back to pre-Civil War stuff and states' rights. Yeah, they were for states' rights until northern states decided, well, we're not going to do this fugitive slave thing. And then suddenly they're for national rights, right? So that's always what they do. And that's what they're going to do here. So there's no safe place it goes back to the Crusades. I love the comments from your
there are great people at the Cottage.
yeah there's no place that's safe from this. If we can't stop it, really stop it, then we're in a world of trouble. As you know, I'm not hopeful.
Yeah, I know you've been warning about this for a very long time. And I can remember when people came down really pretty hard on you, saying that you were paranoid or you were the conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
And it was
they're just fringe people. You're just being alarmist.
Right.
Not just me. There was a handful of us who were in 2009, a handful of us were writing about this stuff. And we, like the Washington Post would write these articles about how, these people are just alarmist. And
right.
And I still hear people say, well, Rushdoony, the Reconstructionists, they had an hour way back when. They didn't have 15 minutes of fame, they had an hour, but it was way back when, and they're gone, and no, they are not gone.
Right. Before we open up for questions, I think it might be helpful. One of the ways that I think about this white Christian nationalism as an umbrella topic and evangelicalism, and this is where Perry and company might be onto something, coming up with a different kind of title for these movements,
Yeah.
is that it includes more than evangelicals now.
Yes.
Is that along the way, so you have this Calvinist, very fundamentalist, very Protestant movement, mostly around conservative Presbyterianism and the conservative Reformed traditions. And then they sort of met up with people who are very unlikely partners. And that is folks out of the charismatic and Pentecostal movement, which would be more like the governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, highly shaped by that movement within Anglicanism. And they had a whole kind of theology of kingdom building sort of ready to go, that sort of the two merged together, called Seven Mountains. And those two groups also hooked up with theocratic Roman Catholics who are trying to reinstate Christendom and the idea of a transnational, at least European or Western vision of politics that would be based in the Vatican. And so we have these three theocratic movements that coalesce, and Steve Bannon has actually been a point of connection between all three of these on a global basis, but they've clearly coalesced in the United States as well as on a more international level. I wonder if that's helpful for people to know that there's kind of three faces theologically of white Christian nationalism.
Well, I think it is helpful, and I think also the questions about it, the whiteness, I think, is really important too, because they clearly aren't, the people in this movement clearly are not all white. Although for me, I tend to think of the aspect of it as whiteness is I mean, having read Anthea Butler, I was deeply moved by her book on evangelical Christian racism.
That's a great book.
Yeah, it really is. And I really came to understand, when you talk about white Christian nationalism, it's not so much that you're not talking about white Christian nationalists. You're talking about a movement, and it's a movement that perpetuates whiteness. Now, a lot of people who are part of this movement are white, but just like with any other movement, people there, and it's also white Christian patriarchal nationalism, and there are a lot of women who support it, right? So
Carrie Lake in Arizona.
Exactly. So the label white here, the adjective white in front of it, I think is really important, and it doesn't connote the idea that all the people in the movement are white. It suggests that the movement comes out of efforts to protect the power of whiteness, to protect white privilege, and that is clearly the case. I mean, particularly with the Christian Reconstructionists, I mean, they cobbled together their view based explicitly on Civil War Southern Presbyterianism that was pro-slavery, and their view of the world is very much rooted in that. There are some ties that I think are worth pointing out between those three different branches, which is that in the 1980s, Gary North, one of the Christian Reconstructionists, was fond of saying that the best way to spread dominion theology across the world was to get it into the hands of the charismatics, because the charismatic movement was growing so quickly. And
I didn't know that.
He did a lot of work with Maranatha Ministries. In fact, he dedicated some books to the Mumfords. And so he was very much in the midst of that. And Christian Reconstructionists always had as their exemplary society the Holy Roman Empire, Constantine. Right. Theocracy. So you can see how those three movements, as different as they are, and this is why I'm reluctant to describe religion purely in theological terms. Theologically speaking, these movements are really different. But I don't know that people care about theology. They care about what's happening on the ground and how to live in the world and what's going to happen next and how are we going to relate to each other.
Yeah.
Those things are cultural.
Yeah. Gosh,
I did say white Christian patriarchal nationalism.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're answering a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's really, part of the conversation makes my mind go back to seminary when I was at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary north of Boston in the 1980s, where so much of this was floating in the ether. And several people who were my classmates wind up being major leaders in this now. So I knew these people, back when, but I just to sort of underscore your comment about those ties between the Reformed, the Charismatic, and the Catholic. Gordon Conwell, the theological impulse was very much this Calvinist, hyper Calvinism, neo Calvinism that is highly patriarchal, and all of the different ways you describe it. And there were fights specifically about Christian Reconstruction. And I can remember a professor getting up in class and saying that the biblical argument about slavery, there was no biblical argument against slavery. And if one read the Bible faithfully, one would come to the same position that 19th century slaveholders did. And I remember sitting in that classroom thinking, wait a second, who what? This is not the world we live in, but it was the world he lived in. So there was that. There was another professor who literally told me that he wanted a civil war on the side, like the Civil War in England with the Puritans and the Anglicans, and that he was anxious to go around smashing every stained glass window in liberal churches across America in order to bring people in line. He also said that he would be a Catholic, except that no one would make him the Pope. So that I thought was a great sort of illustration.
I can kind of relate to that.
Well, I think it's true too, but it would work differently if I said it than this guy was, this very reformed white male authoritarian. And the charismatic movement was really strong, Gordon Conwell then. So there were all these sorts of longings, sort of looking towards the authoritarian and patriarchal structures of Roman Catholicism and saying, hey, those guys got that right. And the use of violence in the Crusades, etc. And then there was the merger of the Reformed and the Charismatic, and it was all just there. It was swirling around me as a young woman, and literally I had no idea that 30 years hence it would be a political movement that is impacting just the elections we're going to have 6 weeks from now. As we move into questions, can you just say real quickly what races you think are the most important? You said local races, and that's really significant. People need to pay attention to who their local candidates are, make good choices. And I think that Doug Padgett's group, Vote Common Good, has some resources for helping you figure that out. I highly recommend going over to the Vote Common Good website. So you've said that about local races, but what national races do you think we should pay attention to that you think are the sort of the most worrisome around Christian
nationalist
nationalist
just
power?
The ones that get all the coverage. We've got a couple here in Florida. The Senate's up for grabs, and because Republicans have been so dumb, we actually, in an off year, have a possibility of not having the big bloodbath that usually occurs. It's Herschel Walker. The race in Georgia, the Senate race in Georgia, the Senate race in Florida, Pennsylvania. Just the ones that, I don't have any special insight on this.
Mastriano is deep in this world.
Mastriano is really deep in this world, more so than, the Florida Senate race is really important. And Rubio as well, he's Rubio, but he's not the true believer, dyed in the wool. He'll follow where things go. But Mastriano is right out in front working for a theocracy. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to start looking to see some of the questions. This one's kind of an interesting question. Where does the prosperity gospel fit in this mess? Have you ever thought about that?
Well, it's prosperity gospel is part of that. So the version of the charismatic movement that evolved from, say, Maranatha Ministries to the New Apostolic Reformation one of the central changes in it was prosperity gospel, and it made them very compatible with all of the Republican political agenda. So I think it's central. I think that the charismatic movement that is in the forefront of Christian nationalism right now is a prosperity gospel charismatic movement.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought very much about it as the hinge that creates a theological environment or a spiritual environment, which capitalism can be completely accepted without question.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you now have an economic system that functionally works with
Well,
the
and it's
economy.
even more than that. It's kind of the old kind of Calvinism where wealth is not just prosperity, but it's evidence of God's favor, and you have that really explicitly in prosperity gospel. I mean, they marry up really nicely.
Let's see if anybody has a question that they want to ask in person. If you want to just kind of hit the button at the bottom where it says reactions, you can put up your hand. Oh, Deb Matthews. Julie, do you remember Deb? She was in my feminist theology class at Westmont. Oh my
I can't,
gosh.
like I'm not seeing, my screen isn't set up so that I can see people really well. So I don't know that I remember her, but I remember that time.
Deb, why don't you ask Julie a question? Like you did, I think, last time about 28 years ago or so.
I am wondering, how do you have a conversation with these people? They're in my family. It's been going on for so long, and how do I either help bring them out or try to live with the tension of having basically Christian Reconstructionists in my family?
Thank you, Deb.
That's a Diana question. That is not a Julie question. I'm always at a complete loss for this kind of stuff. I mean, it's why, I joke about the gallows humor about the darkness, but I don't have anything. Sorry. Diana's the hopeful one. She can help.
I think I'm going to try to, write a little bit of a newsletter about this, because I got several questions in that regard personally. There was another question that came in via my email that's sort of similar in some ways to her question, but one I think, Julie, you might be able to answer. This woman actually asked it from a different angle. She says, when evangelical Christian nationalists break from their leaders, is it do you think something going on within the individual, within the movement, or through an outside influence? And now, see, but you can speak to this because you broke with this movement.
Well, and one of your other questioners just came up in the chat also said about like, why did you guys leave? And consistently across the board, the folks that I have seen leave because there's this lack of fit between them and the demands of evangelical culture. And in my case, it was clearly the expectations for women. I just couldn't function in that context. You left for similar reasons, although you didn't leave of your own accord. But all the ex-evangelicals that we were talking about before, they all have left over. No one leaves over theology. People don't leave over theology. They leave over the reality that this world is not healthy for them. So they are people of color who experience racism. They are women who experience sexism. They are gay or lesbian or transgender and experience all the horribleness that comes with that. I rarely find somebody who isn't driven by experience to rethink theology. But then again, coming back to the sociology of religion, I'm always of the mind that theology follows culture and not the other way around.
Yeah. I think that kind of, if Deb can take that question backwards, that's a really great answer. And one of the ways I think that family members can be, you can engage family members is, if you're a lesbian, or if you're a person that doesn't fit in that system for whatever reason, you've broken with it because of your your gender, whatever it is, and your family still loves you, that can, your sense of identity can be a little bit of a point of leverage, and say, can't you see, as a woman, it didn't work for me at all. They hurt me. They took away my career, or, I'm not allowed to be who I really am. And I'm your daughter, and don't you want me to be who I really am? So you can leverage your experience and your outsiderness with people who are inside that community who might still love you. And I that's, to me, one of the vague possibilities. And that has worked on several occasions with friends that I've had. People who held on being friends with me over the years. Eventually, they didn't bring me back to evangelicalism. I took them out. Which makes me even more dangerous. Okay, Don, and then Jean, who actually asked this question. So, let's let Jean go, because she wants to follow up with the question that I just asked, and then Don, if that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, Jean. Great. Thank you, Diana. Part of what I was reacting to in my question when I said breaking with the leaders is hearing accounts that young people who had gay friends, or transgender, or all or genderqueer friends, could not see anything wrong with these friends. And so they had this dissonance between what they could see, doesn't have to be their own experience, but their friends and their generation, and what their older leaders were doing. That's, to me, an example of a fight that comes, there's like cracks that form within the movement because they've been pushing so hard and so hard shelled. But when cracks happen, can more happen? Can it cascade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's quite compatible with Diana's really good answer, right? Whether the cracks are you created them in family members because the family members love you and you don't fit, or whether they are your close friends that you care about, and you see how damaging all of this can be. There has, I think another important component of my exit was I encountered an evangelical feminist movement. And it gave me, when I wasn't ready to just say, I'm of the mind that the Bible does endorse slavery, by the way. And so I don't care. It's like, okay, it's an ancient book. All right, then. But it's not a rule or a guide or anything that I think anybody should I'm concerned that it did that and that people followed it, but I'm not compelled to follow it anymore. But it took me a long time to get to there. And in the intervening years, there were all kinds of books written by people who were still in that subculture, but who were showing me how contextual the Bible's interpretation is, and how it isn't the readings that I thought were the true reading, what it really said, were a result of communities of discourse developing interpretations, and that they were also, no, I'm too old for it to be Rachel Held Evans. No, earlier, Letha Scanzoni and Nancy Hardesty, and a whole earlier generation than those folks. But
who are largely forgotten now.
I suppose, but they're on my bookshelf.
I know, mine too.
Yeah, I mean, they were really, really important to my evolution, because they gave, I could get just a little ways along the path comfortably, and that let me move more.
That's the work, I think, right now of Kristen Dumas and Beth Allison Barr, who are trying to widen the cracks, I think, around feminism, and help people to, stay in that world, but reform it. And
well, and of course, Kristen's first book was on Catherine Bushnell, who was one of those writers I read. In fact, she might have been the first of them. Catherine Bushnell wrote in like the 1920s. Yep. She's got this old book called God's Word to Women. I can pull it right off the shelf and show you right now. And it rocked my world. And Kristen's first book was about her book.
Right.
Yeah,
I remember that.
Not totally forgotten, but yeah.
Well, a few of us who are historians have memories. Don, go ahead, and we'll wrap up in about 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just read this. I typed it in the notes. And this has to do with that long-term perspective, which you were talking about. And I think that's rooted in the original Reconstructionist eschatological views, which were post-millennial. The way I read them, this would be Rushdoony, Gary North, Bahnsen, they insisted, usually quite vociferously, that the implementation of theonomy would be the work of the Holy Spirit. In other words, God, through the work of conversion and changing people's hearts, would over time build a society in which most people would be Christian. And then they would essentially demand the implementation of biblical law. It wouldn't be a controversy. They would want it. Is this correct? Am I correct in that? And if so, how do these Christian nationalists now justify their current effort of imposing this theocratic view on the rest of us, most of whom are quite unwilling to see this happen?
Well, you are correct. That is what they've said. There's a couple of answers to that. One is that the Seven Mountains Dominionism doesn't take that same caution, right? So their understanding of dominion is much more top down, if you will. And Christian Reconstructionists are like, they're not big fans of Donald Trump necessarily, the people who are still identifying as Christian Reconstructionists, and they're not particularly pushing for states' rights, because what they really want is county rights. So they really do try to do this from the bottom up in a sense, but you have to, no matter what, you have to acknowledge if you're imposing law, then it's not by consensus. There are always some people on whom this is imposed, despite all of their protestations to the contrary, right? So you may have the majority, but you're still, so North will say things like, nobody really believes in religious freedom, and we just need to use religious freedom until we have strangled the public education system such that what did he say? Something about wrapping, like hanging the head of the NEA on the red tape of bureaucracy, or some kind of elaborate thing like that. And then we'll go about destroying the enemies of God. So pluralism is polytheism for them. So while they do say that, and there's something to it, it's also not a coherent kind of strategy. But you read them correctly, I think.
You get it. Okay, I did read them correctly.
I believe so.
Yeah. And that sounded like Gary North, what you just quoted.
Don, I'm really struck by that comment, because I remember it as soon as you started talking about it too. And I remember hearing Julie talk about it over the years. But, it's almost like once people get a taste of power, I mean, they've tasted political power, and it's very hard to turn back on that. Once you feel like you've won the presidency, once you feel like you have senators in your pockets, it's like, well, forget the Holy Spirit.
Well, and I think there's also a reality that they have, and I've used this image in other places. They've the Christian Reconstruction has lit a fire, and then the fire spread. So they don't necessarily, they think that a lot of people who are drawing on their theonomy and their dominion theology, they think that those people are really inconsistent. They talk about it as a lack of epistemological self-consciousness. So they are unhappy that people aren't thoroughgoing enough in the way that they understand Christian Reconstruction. But the truth is, they lit a fire, and now it's out of their control. So it isn't that everybody in Christian nationalism is a Christian Reconstructionist. That's not my argument. My argument is that they set the stage to let this happen. They lit those fires.
And I think that in the chat, Linda Marshall has a comment that is a really good place to kind of begin wrapping up. And that is, she says, not having grown up in this world, I find it very difficult to understand it. It's like a foreign world to me. And I certainly understand that, and we've been using some technical language and terms that definitely come out of evangelicalism from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But I think that what it shows is part of what, Julie, you've been arguing for a really long time, is that you just did it with your fire image, is that you can have something that is on the margins, and for whatever reason, it starts to leaven the whole.
Mhm.
And right now, even though, yes, it is hard to understand the difference between a Christian Reconstructionist and a Seven Mountain Dominionist and Amy Coney Barrett, what was the name of that group she grew up in? The Catholic
People of Praise.
People of Praise, right? Semi-charismatic,
Mhm.
hierarchical Catholic cult, essentially. Sorry, I know you don't like the word cult. We'll call it a sect, Catholic sect, which is kind of a contradiction in terms. But so you can have all those three different things, but yet they're all being energized by sort of the flames that were set a long time ago, that now this big sort of forest fire is burning. And you don't have to know all this stuff about all these details from these various forms of Christianity to understand that these are the flames that are fueling the Republican Party. I mean, that's to me, that is the biggest surprise of all, is that the Republican Party functionally just is letting it burn. And so this is the language. These are the worldview pieces. These are the sort of impulses that have reshaped Republican politics.
And like a forest fire, it's gotten to the point where they can't control it either.
Right. Even Mitch McConnell, who
Can't.
just unbelievable. That's the big surprise to me, that it really worked to that level, that there's an entire national political party now that is being shaped by what was once an obscure argument in a few seminaries in evangelicalism.
Yep.
Oh, and it's all the people I didn't like then. So I think that Lee just wanted to have Lee, do you have a quick word or quick question?
Yeah, just a quick word that all of this is just, supporting what I posted there in the note, that Trump was holding the Bible in 2016, and I was standing there doing the dishes, and Trump said, "Follow me, I've got the keys to the kingdom of heaven." But also he's put, the people are seeing him as the next Messiah.
Yeah.
That's part of the real drive here. And they're proclaiming that he is, and if he gets, crucified or whatever, or they're thinking that he's going to be martyred, and they've got to do whatever, just like what we saw on January 6th. And it's just like, oh my goodness. All right, come on, God. We've got to see, I want to see a St. Paul experience on the road to Damascus. I want to see something along that line, So thank you for this.
Lee, your comment certainly underscores one of Julie's big points, is that evangelicalism is no longer about theology, but it is about politics. Julie, did you see that pamphlet that people took pictures of at a Trump rally recently? And it was the pamphlet was called Donald Trump, the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Applying that Christological title.
Yeah, I have seen that.
Yeah. Well, it is 5:11 on my clock, and that means we've gone a little bit over, but because this is just an incredible subject, and I think that you'll all understand now why Julie and I have been talking for 30 years. We never run out of things to talk about. I would really encourage you, her book, Building God's Kingdom, which came out in 2015, before anybody even dreamed about Donald Trump being elected president of the United States, looks at very specifically at Christian Reconstruction, where it sort of came from within American fundamentalism, and also different themes associated with it, including public education, the role of women, the shape of the family. And so it's a thematically really interesting and helpful book, and it's an ethnography. And what that means is Julie went around and she went to all these conferences and sat down and let people who were within that world tell her their stories. And so you get a real firsthand taste of what the passions are that are driving Christian Reconstruction. So I highly recommend it. The American Academy of Religion put it up as one of their books to be featured in a book and author event at their major national meeting a few years ago. Julie, any final thoughts?
No, just I'm reading all the comments from your folks, and it's just really, really nice. Really nice. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's
Appreciate you doing this with me. It's been really fun. And as always, good to see you and Richard. Hi, Richard.
yeah. And although, you know, it sounds sort of not much to say at the end of all this, because it's like, where's the hope and all those sorts of things. I promise I will try to tackle that with the Cottage community. But the other piece is, you know, vote. I mean, really right now, one of the few tools we have left here is to get out and vote, 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 vote. Every race up and down the ballot. You know, if I was a GOP, I'm real fans of people like who are the anti-Trump GOP types now at the Bulwark and the Dispatch and some other places like that. And people who are long-time Republican operatives are all saying the same thing: vote against every Republican on every ballot, period. Full stop. And that's not from me, longtime Democrat. That's from lifelong Republicans who see this danger, who have been around it and are now being victimized by it. They're on the front lines, actually, of some of the loss of jobs, the pain, and watching this take over their political party. So vote, 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 vote. Get everyone you know to vote. Take buses from the retirement homes. I was in a church in North Carolina this past Sunday, and they actually are doing, in white churches, souls to the polls. They're taking huge buses of white people to the polls on Sunday so that there are white people at the polls voting with Black people in North Carolina, so that the Black people are safe, and those white folks who go to Episcopal and UCC, et cetera, churches are all showing up and they're casting their votes. So those are some things I can think of. I'm glad that we're able to talk about this. And thanks for letting me introduce my friend Julie to y'all.
Bye.
See you online, everyone.